Really glad you're here today. This is a fun time of year for us. We have a lot going on. Let me take just a minute and talk to you about a couple of things. This morning, great to celebrate baptism and great to have our deaf ministry in here. I love what God's doing in all of our different areas of ministry. It's just kind of a fun thing. This morning, there's a good room full of people that are going through our new members class. People occasionally might ask me or say something to Tommy about how do I become a member? We do a fairly regular, I wouldn't say it's every month, but almost every month we do a new members class. And that's not because you have to be smart and pass a test to join our church. It's that we want you to feel connected and have a pathway and a process that really makes sense to you. It's always a next step, and you can always sign up at a next step table if you want to take that step. Or baptism. I saw a stack of cards this week on one of our ladies' desk. It probably is that thick of people who have said, hey, I want to be baptized. And some of you are in that category, and there's only so much we can do to get you to take that step, right? You gotta kind of just initiate that and say, hey, I'm ready to do that, and we'll get you lined up to do so. In a number of weeks here, coming up actually 3 weeks, we have Easter Sunday. And Easter is in church life what Super Bowl is in NFL life, right? And so it's a big weekend. We always put out these invite cards, and I hope that you'll pick them up if you haven't done so already. Hope you pick up the invite cards. And actually, I'm going to talk about it today, but I'm going to tell you something a little different. What I don't want you to do is think that the series today is just a motivation to get you to take an invite card and invite somebody. The series that we're in this week or this month. I want you to think about how it would look if we actually took very seriously the words of Jesus and we lived a missional life, right? If we lived a sent life. And if we said, hey, we're going to take seriously what Jesus tells us to do. If we did that, you know what we would do individually and corporately? We would become an unstoppable force in the world. Absolutely an unstoppable force. And so what I want to do today is I want you to turn to Luke chapter 10 with me. I kind of surprised myself in the 9 o'clock service I was speaking at a little earlier. I actually got done on time. I'm like, man, what happened to me? And what I want to do is I get this way, I think, as the older I get. I want to do a little teaching, and then I want to kind of do a little inspiring, and then I want to do a little bit of call to action. That's kind of how it's going to feel for us today. I also want you to think, when you come every week, that corporate worship is an opportunity. In fact, it's not just an opportunity, it's a necessity. You need it and I need it. I need it more than you need it. I need to reorient my mind because all week long, where we live, what the world we're living, the culture we live in is sending us these messages that this is important. And you know all those things are, right? Money's important, job is important, performance is important. All these things are important. And you begin to believe those things, and you need to come to church because you need something to reorient your mind that, hey, those things aren't as important as you think they are, right? There's some things that are more important than those things. You need a relationship with Jesus, and your life ought to be shaped by that. And you're not going to do that if we just try to intellectually, right, just pour information into you. Your heart needs to be, it needs to be recalibrated, like your mind needs to be reoriented so that your love for God and your love for the truth of God becomes the inner compulsion of your life. And so what I want you to do is not, like here's the easy thing. Okay, in 45 minutes, I'm gonna be walking out the door and I'm gonna be going to the restaurant. That's not the point, right? What you need to do is in these 45 minutes, you really, really desperately need God to speak to your heart, right? And by the way, God can speak to my heart while I'm preaching. I want God to speak to my heart about this. Gospel of Luke. I'm going to tell you one of the best stories Jesus tells in the entire Bible. Gospel of Luke is 24 chapters long. We started in Luke 4 last week, Luke 10 this week, Luke 24 next week. If you took the Gospel of Luke and you divide it into two sections, first 9 chapters asks a very important question and answers the question. The question it asks is this: who is Jesus? It answers that question by telling us that Jesus is truly the Son of God, right? He is the Son of God, and that has implications. Luke chapter 10 through the end of the book, all the way through Luke chapter 24, asks and answers this question: if Jesus is who he says he is, how should that shape and influence my life? In other words, what does it really mean for me to be a follower of Jesus? If he is the Son of God, what does it look like for me to follow him? And in this transition, Luke 10 is a transition chapter. You have Jesus sending out 70 disciples, that's verses 1 through 16. And it is inspirationally, thematically, it is this: how do we as followers of Jesus message the gospel, right? How do we do gospel messaging? How do we verbalize the gospel, right? And then Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 25, there's this little exchange where Jesus ends up telling a story. It's one of my favorite stories. I think it's one of the capstone stories. There's so many of them in the Gospel of Luke. This is one of the most important stories that Jesus tells. And it is actually answering this question: how do we gospel neighbor, right? Gospel message, how do I speak the gospel? How do we gospel neighbor? How do we practice the gospel as a good neighbor, right? How do we visually put the gospel on display? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me read to you this little story, and I want you to use your imagination. And behold, a certain lawyer. Now, we could stop there and talk about lawyers. We're not going to do that. And a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him. That idea is this: is the guy thought he was smarter than Jesus. The reason he thought he was smarter than Jesus, he had this inner issue going on in his life, and he wanted to justify himself to Jesus. So he said, "Master, what shall I do," underline the word do, "to inherit eternal life?" Now he's thinking, I'm going to trap Jesus in an answer. And so Jesus answered by not answering the question, by asking another question. By the way, if somebody's trying to pin you down, don't answer their question, ask them a question, right? And so Jesus says, what is written in the law? How do you read that? In other words, how do you interpret what the law is saying? So the man thinks, hey, I'm a lawyer, right? I'm the smartest person in the room. I got him right where I wanted him, right? He's asking me to answer a legal question. How do you read the law? How do you interpret the law? That's what lawyers do. And so this lawyer says, well, here's how I read the law. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind and with all thy strength and with all thy strength and with all thy mind. And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, what this lawyer has skillfully done is he's summarized there's 613 commandments in the law in the Old Testament, 613. And by the way, here's why this is important, right? All of us have a tendency to think that if we check the boxes, that makes us good people. Do you know why people struggle with Christianity? Because they only see Christianity as a box-checking exercise, right? If I check the boxes, I'm a good Christian. And this guy is actually falling into the same trap, and he's saying, let me tell you something, there's really 2 important boxes, and if you check those 2 important boxes, then if you do those things, man, you are at the pinnacle. And Jesus actually says to him, thou hast answered right, this do and thou shalt live. Now, here's how we know that the lawyer had a problem. He had a deeper issue, right? He was trying to justify himself. And so he says to Jesus, because he knows he hasn't been loving his neighbor like he should, he said, well, who's my neighbor? And then Jesus tells a story. Here's the story. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance, in other words, there just happened to come down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise, a Levite, when he was at that place, came and looked on him and passed by on the other side. So two guys, both religious, and by the way, culturally, they were duty-bound, obligated. Their job was to care for the poor. Literally, they were responsible for administering the funds that were available to help people in need. That was their job, okay? They see this man and they pass by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him. That word compassion means that he was moved in his emotional life, in his inner life, and he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence, gave them to the host, and said unto him, take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now these three, so the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, which of these three do you think was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? And he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, go and do thou likewise. Go live that way. See, all of life is going to come down to this. I want you to, this is the big idea. This is the point we're going to wrestle with today. You are either going to live by duty. You are either going to live motivated by guilt. You are either going to live by doing what you think is the morally right thing to do, or you are going to live by an eternal spiritual dynamic. Now, those two things are radically different. In fact, they're so different that you can do one and be religious and still be very, very far from God. And you can't do the other one, live by an inner, eternal, spiritual dynamic, until you have been radically transformed by the grace of God. Love for God, loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, loving God is the key to living life. In fact, the more you love God, the more radical you will be in demonstrating your love for your neighbor. I can't emphasize this enough. My goal today is not to get you, not to guilt you into inviting people to church. That's not the goal. The goal today is not for me to try to pressure you to make you feel bad about what you do or what you don't do, because here's what Jesus is teaching us. Loving your neighbor is not the way to life. It's not how you get life. It's not how you get favor with God. Loving your neighbor is the way of life for those of us that have been transformed by the grace of God. So let's talk today about what it means to love your neighbor. Let's talk about what it would look like for us to become an unstoppable force in the world. We're going to answer 3 questions. We're going to look at this story this way. What does it cost us to love our neighbor? Because loving our neighbor is not typically what we think it is. It's actually much more than that. Where do we get the power to love our neighbor? And then in practical ways, what does it mean for us to love our neighbor? That's what we're going to look at today. The price for loving our neighbor. Jesus is not giving us a suggestion. He's actually giving us a mandate. And the mandate is to share the message of the gospel, not just verbally, but visually. Not just in word, but also in deed. The story shows us that true love, the kind of love that transforms people, is costly, sacrificial, and dangerous. I have a really good neighbor. I can't say that that's always been true, but there have been times where Lisa and I have had really good neighbors. And I can think when our kids were little, we lived in Murray Hill. If you're familiar with that part of town, one of my deep regrets in life is I sold the house I owned in Murray Hill. If I'd kept it, I'd probably be a rich person today and I'd probably be retired on an island somewhere. I'd have like $10,000 and I would think that the whole world, right, solved the problem. I had really good neighbors there. But we have a really good neighbor. He moved in next to us after we'd lived there for a while. His wife was in a assisted living facility. She had some really deep medical issues, and eventually she passed away. And he is the nicest guy. He is the nicest guy. And he's a good neighbor. This last week, he did what he's done on occasion for me. He took my trash can on Friday morning and he put it up by the garage at our house. And you'd think, right, well, that makes him a Christian. Because only Christians would do that. Our tendency is to think, hey, that's the kind of good neighbor that Jesus is asking us to be, right? If we cut our lawn, it helps if we cut a little bit of the next guy's lawn too, right? If we blow the leaves off the front of our driveway, we're gonna blow the leaves off the front of his driveway. You don't blow your leaves onto his driveway, you blow his leaves, right? That's being a good neighbor. What Jesus is actually doing is he's saying, hey, you got the whole wrong idea of what is being a neighbor. That really doesn't cost you anything. To be a good neighbor is actually way different than that. And the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan, what it does is it answers the great question, what is at the core of loving your neighbor? And this is where it gets to be a problem for all of us. Let me give it to you quickly. It's in your outline. We're going to do this quick. To be a good neighbor, to love your neighbor means you love people that are different from you. It's easy to love people that are like you. But the Good Samaritan and the Jew were the most unlikely people to be helping each other. They were opposite religious persuasions. They came from two different cultures. See, we are so superficial and surface level people. Let me tell you what it's really like. Some of you think, if I can tolerate the person in my family that roots for the Georgia Bulldogs or the Florida Gators and I happen to be for the other one, then I'm really a good neighbor. That's not what this is talking about. That doesn't make you a good neighbor. This just makes you a normal human being, right? Being a good neighbor means that the people that you're least likely to love, the people that you do not easily relate to, the people that you have the least in common with, are the people that you find the gospel is drawing you to and is saying to you, those people need to be loved in transformative ways. It's loving people who are different than you. Then secondly, to be a good neighbor, the price for loving your neighbor, you love people by doing difficult things. Right? It's not just, anybody can take the trash can and put it up by I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm glad he did it. I really am. But this is way more complex. The first two guys pass by on this dangerous road. They see a man that's been robbed, he's been ambushed, he's been beaten, he's bleeding, he's naked, he's lying in a ditch, and they're saying to themselves, this is not good. I'm not gonna stop. I don't wanna endanger myself. This would be a very difficult thing to do. I'm not getting involved. And by the way, you know what the problem is in our world? This is an inherent problem in affluent Western civilization and culture. We just really don't wanna get involved. It's not our problem, right? So we don't do the difficult things. We don't love people that are different than us. Then thirdly, the price for loving your neighbor, you love people by sacrificing for them. When you meet the needs of people, and by the way, look what this guy does. He gets involved, not just physically, but he gets involved in the hurt and pain of the wounded man. He pours into his life medicine. He pours into his life time, money, commitment. He reaches deep past the surface issues of life, and he gets involved in a way that causes him to pay the price. Here's what we mean by that. We're to meet the needs of people. This is what it means to love your neighbor. This is gospel neighboring. We meet the needs of people with such sacrifice and authenticity that the people that we're helping will want, at the very least want, and probably most likely need to hear the gospel in order to make sense out of your life. They're actually thinking to themselves, why would you do this for me? What are you getting out of this? See, the question is, what does the Good Samaritan get out of helping this guy? Nothing. He's sacrificing. Let me tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm going to relate it to the principle I'm trying to teach you. And I think it was, my dates may not be perfect, but I think it was 2018. I was in Nepal, and I was doing an event with a mission organization. I spoke to, they told me that there was going to be several hundred church planners, Nepalese church planners, that we were going to do some training for. When we got there, there were several thousand church planners there. And I mean, the room was packed. The room was not as big as the downstairs, no balcony. Downstairs of our auditorium was shaped a little different, but no bigger than this. There were no chairs. Everybody sat on the floor. I didn't sit on the floor. I had a chair, but if I was sitting on the floor, I probably wouldn't have gotten up off the floor. But they were sitting on the floor, and I spoke a couple times to them, and then I did a couple breakout sessions. And those several thousand, we were challenging them to plant 1,000 churches. That was the goal. See if we get 1,000 churches planted in Nepal. They committed to plant 30,000 churches. I mean, it was an incredible God moment experience. I've had a few of those in my life. It was one of those. While you're in Nepal, everybody talks about Mount Everest, and it just dominates whatever's happening there. And so I got interested in Mount Everest several years, or a year or so after that. Lisa and I were actually at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. We had dinner there, and they showed at the Air and Space Museum, it was this event we were at, they showed a documentary that included a documentary of Mount Everest. And so Mount Everest has become kind of an intriguing thing to me. I've read several books. I know a lot of different stories. In 2006, a man by the name of David Sharp was coming down. He was descending from the peak at Everest. And he got, as does happen occasionally, he got disoriented, and he was oxygen deprived, and he was struggling. He was having a hard time getting down off the mountain. And he got down what most people think is kind of just down into what the safe zone is, where the oxygen levels are up that people can usually recover. Not always, but they can. And he sat down in what is commonly called a green boot cave, because there's a man who in 1996 died descending from Everest. He died at that spot underneath this rock, this overhang rock, and he died with boots on. He had green boots, and so his body's frozen there in memorial. It's just there in time. And so David Sharp sits down beside this guy, and he's struggling. It's evident that he's struggling. They've been able to piece it together. There's eyewitness testimony. While he was sitting there struggling for life, 40 mountain climbers who were on their way up to the top stepped around him, went right past him, and continued all the way up to the top. And then they turned around and came down. David Sharp died in that spot, never moved. Nobody stopped to help him. Sir Edmund Hillary, who was the first man to climb Everest, said about that, I think the whole attitude towards climbing Mount Everest has become rather horrifying. The people just want to get to the top. Now, think about this. Think about the implications of this and what that really means. The point that Edmund Hillary was making is the top of the mountain became so important. It was of chief importance. People would have never said that. Nobody would have ever said, hey, getting to the top of the mountain is more important than human life. Nobody would ever say, I value the top of the mountain more than I value saving individual human lives. But the way we act, the culture that we adopt becomes the truly chief important thing. Here's the problem. You say, what does that have to do with the church in 2025? Here's the problem. We have a tendency to live in this culture in a way that says getting to the top of the mountain is more important than rescuing lost sinners. Do you get that? Because what we actually value are things that are outside the scope of what Jesus is asking us to do. And Jesus is actually saying at the very heart of what it means for you to be a follower of me, what it really truly means to love me with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the price of loving. What do you love that you would be willing to do that, right, to the exclusion of what Jesus asked you to do? Number two, the power for loving your neighbor. Now, I want to get this across to you. I think this is the most important part of what I'm going to say today. You should read this story, and it should actually begin to kind of press on you. What would cause somebody to live like this? What would cause somebody to live in a way that rescuing hurting people is more important than my time, is more important than my money, is more important than my cultural identities, that's more important than my comfort and convenience? See, there's a lot of people that think in the back of their mind, when I get time, when I get money, when I have opportunity, I'm really gonna put God first, and I'm gonna serve God very passionately. You don't really love God. What you're doing is you're using God to hopefully get to the place where you can do those things. You see that? Jesus is shattering that. In your outline, if you want a statement, write this down. You'll need more than moralism to love your neighbor. You are either going to be driven by duty or guilt in your life, right? Guilt and duty are going to become the primary motivations for your life, and guilt and duty are always going to be entirely and wholly inadequate. You'll never completely do or live the life that God has for you if you only do what you do for God out of guilt and duty. In fact, I can say this to you fairly confidently. The problem with Western Christianity, and probably more so in the last 50 years in Western civilization church life, is this: that we default to a moralistic motivation, a guilt and a duty for why we do what we do, not being fueled by gospel grace. This guy was religious, the Levite and the priest were religious. In fact, if you understand this, religion and politics are cultural shapers, and yet religion and politics, although they always tell you, right, that you have a moral obligation to the poor, politics don't have a good solution for how do we care for the poor. Religion doesn't have a good solution for how we care for the poor. Every major world religion tells you we got to care for the poor. Jesus is actually saying to you that you can know that it's the right thing to do, but you will not do it just because it's the moral thing to do. Something has to happen inside of you in order for you to be engaged, in order for you to live sacrificially, in order for you to do difficult and hard things, in order for you to love people that are completely different than you. Well, if that's the case, then what does it take? Here's the second thing in this outline, the power of loving your neighbor. You will not become a radical neighbor until you've been loved by a radical neighbor. Now, I'm gonna take a chance that you can get this without me unpacking this in a really deep way. One of the things so masterful about this story is that Jesus is telling a story that's leading this man away from where he started to where he needs to be, right? The question that the man asks is, who is my neighbor? Jesus tells a story that actually doesn't answer that question. It introduces another question that he forces the man to answer. The question that it introduces is which one of these three was neighbor unto him that fell among thieves? See, our tendency is always this, right? Our tendency is to always start out, well, who is it that I have to love? Because we're thinking if you let us answer that question, we're going to check the box, right? We're going to perform the duty. When I look around, I look around in this room, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm at least as good as most of the people in this room. Isn't that how you tend to look at your life? You look at people, a lot of people that are worse than you, right? I'm not like them. I'm pretty good. That's not the issue. Jesus says, who's the one that acted the most neighborly? He's going to flip this upside down. See, until you see Jesus in the story as the Good Samaritan, right? Here's what he's trying to get the guy to see. You see yourself as the Good Samaritan. You see yourself as the one that's going to come to rescue people. Until you see that you're the one that's lying naked in the ditch. Right? Until you see that you were helpless and that apart from the unmerited and undeserved mercy of the Good Samaritan, you would have been left to die in the ditch. And the only way that you and I ever got out of the ditch, look at verse 33. As he journeyed, a certain Samaritan came where he was. The only way you get out of the ditch is when you were lying in the ditch, Jesus came to where you were and he found you and he got into the well of suffering with you and he got into the ditch and he pulled you out of the ditch and he did everything that you could not do for yourself, right? He put you on his beast and he carried you to an inn and he bound up your wounds and he poured in your medicine and he poured out his life for you. Until you see that, you'll think, if I take my neighbor's garbage can and bring it up every once in a while, I'm a good neighbor. But when you see you were lying in the ditch, you were naked, your life was over, you had absolutely nothing, and Jesus came here. I had dinner with a guy this week. I'm gonna be careful how I say this to you. I do this occasionally. I don't do it for wrong reasons, and I don't want you to judge. And the reason I'm telling you that, I really don't want you to judge my motive wrongly about this. I was having a conversation with a guy, and we were talking about success. We were talking about what it's like to be financially independent, and it was a good conversation. And there was reasons that we were having this conversation. And while we were having dinner downtown, I thought, I'm gonna take him and show him our rescue mission. And so I told him what I was gonna do. And I do this occasionally. I really don't have bad motive for doing it. I wanted to see it was gonna make sense for some of the things that we were talking about. And when I tell people we're involved in homeless ministry, they don't know what that means, right? They have this picture in their mind. I think what they think oftentimes is, yeah, you make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and you give it to hungry people every once in a while and you care about homeless people. And that's fine. If that's what people do, that's a great thing to do for people. I think there's nothing wrong with that, right? So we pull up to the rescue mission and I have this experience. I mean, I've had it so many times. Like, he's just absolutely, he's blown away, right? He's like, well, tell me what you do. I said, well, I'm gonna show you. So we get out of the car, and I love going down this. One of my favorite things that we do is one of my favorite things to be able, and I get out of the car, and the people at the rescue mission, they know me, right? And so they come up and they start hugging me, and they're talking to me like we're friends, which I am with a lot of them, right? Now, my favorite thing is they start hugging him. Because they're like, hey, we love you. This guy must be with you, so he must be your friend. So and I love the look on there. I can tell you stories about that. I mean, the look on his face is priceless, right? And he's speechless. And this is what he said. He said, I had no idea. And you know why he had no idea? Because until you've experienced God's love in your life radically, you will not love radically. Do you get that? That's what he's teaching us. Now, real quick, I'm gonna close with this. The practice for loving your neighbor. You say, what should we do? I think there's just a couple of quick applications. See, this is not the application. The application is don't take this and go find the one person that you feel obligated to invite because you want to get it off your conscience. You don't want Tommy to ask you, have you invited somebody to church? You don't want me to talk about it next week and think I haven't done this. The application is not take this and go invite somebody, okay? Now, do I think you would be invited? If you will love Jesus radically, you'll find as many people as you can and invite them, right? Lisa and I ran into a guy we'd known since he was a teenager yesterday and invited him to church. And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking, I was telling Tommy about this, I kept thinking to myself, I hope he doesn't come tomorrow. I really want him to come on Easter. That's moralism, right? We don't want you to come. We want you to come because we want credit for it. No, we want you to just get involved in people's lives. Three things, ready? Real quick. Number one, you must get close to people in need. We live in a culture that says we want people with problems over there, and we only want healthy and whole people in here. Proximity to hurting people is gospel neighboring. Let me say that to you again. Proximity to hurting people is gospel neighboring. I cannot say this to you enough. If you want to write a statement down, people who are hurting more than they need anything else, they need somebody to get in the well of suffering with them. Right? You may think what they want is my money, what they want is my time. That's not what they want. They want you and me to get into the well of suffering. The most impactful ministry that I do and have done for 43 years is not large group gatherings. The most impactful ministry that I ever do is personal ministry to people in need. And I actually enjoy that as much and more than I enjoy almost anything else they do, because you actually get to see the difference that you make in people's lives. What people need is for you to get close to them, to get in contact with them, to build relationships with them. If all you do is you have this little life where you put a little wall of self-protection around you and you're very guarded about who gets in, you're not gospel neighboring. You're not loving your neighbor. You say, but wait a minute. I have some really unhealthy people in my life. Now you're getting there. Do you get that? You're actually loving people that Jesus wants you to love. You're loving the kind of people that you can make a difference in their life. You got to come close to people in need. Number two, you have to combine words and deeds. You actually have to begin holistic ministry. Healthy ministry is where you combine faith and words. When you weave together a verbal and visual demonstration of the gospel. It's not just what you say, but what you do, right? That's why, and I know this is just a one-off application, but that's why serving on a serve team is so critically important. Because what you're actually saying is, I'm not only just gonna say I believe this, I'm going to live out that I believe it. I'm gonna put this into practice. That's why being in a small group, you say, well, I don't need to be in a small group. My life is perfect. Well, I doubt that. But I can assure you there's people in that small group that need you, right? That's why giving your money, that's not something that you do when you get a little extra. That's something you do because you actually want to sow into needs. You want to weave together both the visual and verbal demonstration of the gospel. And the third thing, real quick, last thing, you must be willing to cross boundaries. There's two, one's implied, one's explicit. Implied boundary is class, right? Explicit boundary that he crossed is race. Go back to what I said at the very beginning. Loving your neighbor is loving people that are different from you. The two ways that we see people differently is by class and by race. And when you're willing to cross social class and racial boundaries, you're actually just beginning to live out the gospel. You say, why is that? Because if you go back to verse number 29, it says he willing to justify himself. Here's the single greatest issue that all of us have to get over. Our hearts are producing self-righteousness. Our hearts are arguing, this is what makes us who we are. This is how we get our standing. This is how we get life. And so if we can make up the rules, we can feel better about ourselves. Jesus is saying, it's not how you see you. It's how you experience the gospel. It's how you relate to the Good Samaritan who's come and rescued you when you fell into the ditch. That's how you define your life. That's where you build your identity. And if you see yourself as somebody who's been rescued from the ditch, you won't look down on anybody else that's ever fallen into a ditch. Let's stand together for prayer. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed. Just stand with me if you would. Some of you, and here's the challenge today, right? Some of you need to be rescued. You feel more than anything else. You say to yourself, I'm in a ditch. I need somebody to come in and pull me out. The Good Samaritan, Jesus, has done that. He left heaven on his journey. He came to where you were. He was moved with compassion for you, right? He didn't just risk his life by coming to the ditch. He went to the cross and laid down his life so that you could be saved. Today, that's who you need to trust. The Good Samaritan. That's who you need to put your faith in, Jesus Christ. For others of you, you know, hey, I want to be a good neighbor. I really want to pour myself out. Like, I've been radically rescued by Jesus, and if I've been rescued by Jesus, then I want to be part of rescuing other people. You can do that. Every single, and imagine what an unstoppable force the church would be in the world, right? If we radically loved our neighbor. Father, speak to our hearts. Help us to find not only ourselves in this story, but to find you. To see ourselves as having been rescued by Jesus and transformed by his love. And may that carry over in the way we live our lives. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.